Hello again, 201. In this video, I will go over the first two questions on environment and demographics of Chapter 4, Latin America. And this region's biggest environmental concern is related to deforestation and the loss of biodiversity and the livability of urban areas. Much of Latin America is very similar to the Marianas Islands. It's tropical. Northern Mexico, Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Santiago, Chile, however, are not. Balancing global market forces with the ecological conservation will be the issue in this century. The coastal forests of Brazil and the Pacific coast forests of Central America have largely disappeared. And sugarcane plantations were the colonial era reason for deforestation. Tropical rainforests account for only 6% of the Earth's landmass, but at least 50% of the world's species are found in this biome. Latin America has the greatest reserve of biological diversity in the world. The Amazon basin contains the largest undisturbed stretches of rainforest in the world. It receives 60 inches of rainfall annually. I think a lot of these statistics are from some older editions when I did this course in the past. So some of these numbers might not be exact anymore in the newer edition. And I encourage you to change and notify me if you see discrepancies in some of these statistics. The Amazon River is navigable for 2,000 miles. It's the second longest in the world. Only the Nile is longer than the Amazon in Africa. Unlike in Southeast Asia, where market forces drive deforestation, state governments in Latin America cut and burn forests to clear for land redistribution and to reward political cronies. But the soil is poor and settlement is sparse, the opposite of the intention. Because once you yank the trees out, the soil becomes brittle. There's nothing holding it together. And when those rains come during rainy season, it ends up washing away. And all you're left with is Haiti, which is basically rock now because of the deforestation that's gone on what was Hispaniola. And it's the same things happening in other parts of this region. 20% of the Brazilian Amazon, as of 5 years ago, was being deforested. And here are some of the corporate interests that are causing this. He is no longer president. Grassification is the conversion of tropical forest into pasture. There are many geography terms that I go over in the course of these lectures. The deforested land becomes pasture land, which is excellent for cattle ranching, and that's a status symbol vocation in Latin America because they are descended, many of these residents today, from the Spanish influence. Traditionally, cattle ranching was predominant in Colombia, Venezuela, and Argentina. The lax policies of the 60s through the 80s enabled ranching to boom, and that resulted in a collapse in beef prices in the 80s. When you overproduce something, you create a bubble, and when that happens, sooner or later it goes bust and prices go through the floor. On agricultural lands, peasant farmers were encouraged to adopt new hybrid varieties, and we're going to see this over and over again in many different regions. This happens then, native plants are slowly forced out because these hybrids tend to be more resistant. They're stronger, and then natural selection takes place. There's problems with fertilizers and pesticides. In Sinaloa, Mexico, birth defects were on the rise 4 or 5 years ago, and the sprawl of Latin American cities consumes arable land and water, eliminating the best farmland. In the 60s, they began this frontier colonization plan, hoped to exploit the Amazon's resources and provide land for the peasants. The forest proved incapable of handling permanent agricultural colonies, and as I mentioned, it degraded into clay-like surfaces. And when that gets hard, it's like concrete. You're not going to plant anything in that. And they cleared forests, and it's got 4 times the population of what it had 50 years ago. And there are very, very high population growth rates as life expectancy and fertility rates have increased. They're not having as many children as they did 50 years ago, but they still have 2, 3, 4, which is much higher than replacement. Replacement, ladies and gentlemen, is a couple having 2 children. They replace themselves. That is stable population. It's not growing and it's not declining. And this is still an accurate statistic. I'm pretty sure most of that population is still under 30 in many countries. Environment. Mexico City is the site of the ancient Aztec civilization, and it retains its importance today. 160 plus years it's been independent, since the 1810s. The area is severely degraded from its ancient splendor. The quality of air, it's still an issue there. The problem is that Mexico City is well above sea level and it sits in a bowl. It's like Los Angeles. It's the same phenomenon. And it's surrounded by snow-capped volcanoes, which creates a thermal inversion that traps exhaust, industrial smoke, garbage, and fecal matter from cattle ranching, and it creates smog. Air emergencies sometimes require children and the elderly to remain indoors. They're slowly going to unleaded gasoline, which, as I mentioned, in North America, that has gone a long way towards solving air quality problems. In ancient times, there was an abundance of water that made the site attractive for settlement. Large, shallow lakes once filled the valley. Agricultural production drained these lakes, and wells were dug to capture fresh water. 70% of the water used in Mexico City comes from a massive aquifer, similar to the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States. Unlined drainage canals leak into the soil, which leach into the aquifer, and it's become slightly contaminated. Water's being pumped from many kilometers away to reduce the reliance on one source. And the continued pumping of water from the aquifer is causing the city to sink. It sank 9 meters in the 20th century, compared to Venice, which is a city on stilts in Italy, and it only sank 2.5 centimeters. Pumping of water from the city center is now stopped, and it's slowing the rate. Outlying areas are still sinking due to the pumping of water. Air pollution, lack of treated water, and garbage removal are some of the pressing environmental problems. Water scarcity and water quality are considered national security issues today. It does have better access to sewers and electricity than many parts of Asia and Africa. Industrialization has caused a lot of these problems. In Curitiba, Brazil, this is a very green place. It's enabled a city of 2 million to be far less polluted. Drainage parks have been created, recycling and clean public transportation, usually using natural gas instead of oil-based petroleum fuel, gasoline. Natural gas is much cleaner and has much less byproduct of exhaust. Population. In those years, this population tripled. That's unbelievable, because infant mortality rates dropped and diseases were controlled. One of the triumphs of the 20th century, ladies and gentlemen, has been the eradication of many diseases that 100 years ago were quite commonplace. Malaria, yellow fever, tuberculosis. These are all gone now because of inoculations. Here are the countries that make up 75% of that increase. And since the 1990s, Mexico City has slowed its growth. What makes up the Latin American city? Most of it is urban now. It's shifted from being a rural region to urban. And that's one of the themes of this course in general, ladies and gentlemen. The continued urbanization of many regions of the world. And these are the big cities. Buenos Aires, Lima, Peru, Caracas, Venezuela, Santiago, Chile, and Guatemala City. Excuse me. Here are the megapolis areas. We talked about this in North America. These are basically continuous cities. The urban nature of these regions, it's just a solid concrete area. The urban form tends to follow the central business district with an elite spine and newer businesses extending from the core to the newest parts of the city. In the central business district, the elite spine and the residential sectors, services and utilities are excellent. But as you go out against the periferico or the ring or the beltway, life is much more difficult. The best residential areas are on either side of the spine, and there's pictures of this in the textbook. And if you're interested in it, I can mail you some documents as well. But they don't show up on this particular document. Other names for the periferico is the barrio, the favelas in Brazil, or Pueblo Nuevas. These are squatter settlements. And people in these neighborhoods engage in the informal sector. We're going to see this in other regions of the world. A fundamental force that houses, services, and employs these people in these various occupations. The housing's self-built. If unopposed, they'll improve it. But again, they don't really have title to the areas that they're living in. This is a worldwide phenomenon because there is not as many people needed in farming occupations anymore because of mechanization. When women migrate, they tend to be less inclined to have a lot of babies because birth control is more readily available. And if they're working, they also do not want to have as many children. Historically, control of land has been the basis of political and economic power in Latin America and the root of most social and economic tension. The encomienda system was the colonial system of the Spaniards, where you had the Don at the top who provided for the basic needs of the peasants who worked the land or the plantation underneath him, and it was a completely exploitative system. Usually it devolved into almost semi-slavery. And that's about it. Oh, a couple more things. I will go over this other part in the next part.